November success has been something that has been a Tennessee tradition, like the abused walking horse, the checkerboard end zones, the power T, running through the power T. November success has been something that has been monstrous for Tennessee. And I think it will continue to be the case given who the Vols play. So they'll play UConn, then they'll play Missouri, and then they'll play Vanderbilt. But there's that Georgia game, which is going to be really tough to get around. So I don't know that November success continues. But if you look back over the years, I'm curious your thoughts on November success, because we can call it success because you beat Kentucky and Vanderbilt back in the day, but those are horrible teams. And Tennessee, it seemed like it was a 50-50 of showing up and not being fantastic in those games and really struggling in those games. So tell me, November success, is that a Tennessee tradition, or is that just happenstance with Vanderbilt and Kentucky being awful?
It's happenstance. It is absolutely. I would actually argue that given the fact that they played Vanderbilt, Kentucky, if you look at Tennessee's historical November record, I think they've underachieved in November. Honestly, I mean, So there was a period in the 90s. I think you can go back to, I would say, there was a period from like 1991. I think it started in 1991, and it went all the way to 1998. Tennessee lost one game in November, but that one game was to Memphis, which they never should have lost in 96. And so I look back and I say, wow, you usually play your, let's be honest, Dave. You usually historically played you didn't just play Vanderbilt and Kentucky in November. You played your homecoming game in November.
Okay.
Here's you have these games.
True. Here's another factor going back into the day. And let's just forget about bullet head, bad haircut, and fancy haircut. Okay. Let's take those out
fancy
of the equation.
He had
fancy pants.
Fancy. And also, and then the coach before him liked to remove his pants for. Okay, never mind. Sorry.
Okay. Nothing questions a man's toughness like saying, "Hey, fancy pants." But let's remember this: Tennessee was deeper. Okay, so other teams like Vanderbilt and Kentucky would suffer an injury, and it would have a major impact on their program because there was a drop off to the second team guy. How close is Tennessee to that, or are they? Because their second team, there were a lot of years that they could have not won an SEC championship, but they could have certainly gone 6-6 or 6-5 or 5-6, been respectable. How close is Tennessee to that before we get into recruiting visitors for the weekend?
How close is Tennessee to where they can lose players and still dominate Vanderbilt and Kentucky?
Yeah, because, I mean,
I think they're already there with Vanderbilt.
Okay, they've lost Kamal Haddon. They've lost Keenan Peely, who I think would have made Tennessee considerably better in the front seven, even though they're pretty good. So,
I mean, they're already at the point where these injuries can help them beat the lesser teams in the SEC. They're not at the point where they can withstand injuries.
Injuries not help them. Okay, restate that. I think you misspoke.
They're already at the point where they can withstand injuries when facing lesser SEC competition. For the most part. Now, Florida, they're not fully there because, again, Cooper Mays, Florida, that I guess, as I say that out loud, that's not true. But you're right. They lost Kamal Haddon and Keenan Peely and still beat Kentucky last week on the road. So I think they're already there. Where they're not is that, I do question if they can withstand the loss to Kamal Haddon when they're playing Georgia in 2 weeks. And that's kind of the big question right now. Now, last year, Tennessee lost Cedric Tillman and went off to a 7-0, 8-0 start. But that's because nobody knew how good Jalen Hyatt was.
You mean to go ahead and tell you what's going to happen against Georgia? I mean,
Sure.
I'll go ahead and tell you. It's the exact same game plan that they ran against Kentucky. So you're going to be frustrated, Tennessee fans, by Carson Beck completing a high percentage and gobbling up a bunch of yards, but they're not going to let the running game beat them. And What they did against Kentucky is frustrating, and I could sense it in Tim Banks's press conference, Tennessee's defensive coordinator this week. He didn't like that style at all. He doesn't like running a bunch of zone, but here's the difference. I don't want to go too deep football IQ here because I know people can get bored and glassy-eyed. But when you're playing zone, you're facing the line of scrimmage. So you're able to be a part of run support, even if that's not what you're directed to do in that particular play, because you're like, they're running the ball, I'm going, as long as you're disciplined. When you're playing man, your back's flipped. So I think Kentucky was clearly about getting ready to play Georgia because they're going to want to stop the run. And if Carson Beck can go out and beat them, then they're the better team and still the better program at this point. But that's what you're going to see. You didn't even see many zone blitzes. You just saw straight up zone, Caleb, which is, I mean, I watched Tim Banks' press conference twice, and it was almost like, okay, it was almost like you go and you get a really good, you get good results and good test results from your colonoscopy. You didn't enjoy the colonoscopy, but you won because they didn't find any polyps or cancer.
Yes,
you're too young to know what a colonoscopy
no,
is.
I know what it is, but
okay.
Yeah, I get what you're saying.
Thoughts on colonoscopy comparisons on the message board? Is that apt? That's what Tim Banks went through against Kentucky, and it may pay off against Georgia.
So
congratulations on the test results, by the way, Tim Banks.
This is basically what Monty Kiffin's whole Tampa 2 defense was about, right?
A lot, yeah.
That was the whole point of the defense was play zone and trust your defensive line to get the pressure on its own. You don't need your linebackers to do it. And that's why he was able to cheat Eric Berry up at linebacker. He wanted him playing more of that level. So, okay, so kind of stepping it back a little bit, where are you with this, Dave? Do you think that, remember Johnny Majors used to say, I always told my players they remember what you do in November? You think Johnny Majors was just full of BS and it had everything to do with who Tennessee was playing? You think he was actually serious? Like, oh no, we step our game up in November.
I thought they stepped their game up.
No, I think they always struggled with Vanderbilt.
No. I think Tennessee under Fulmer, I think they stepped their game up largely depending on what Florida did. And Travis asking, did Dave say he enjoys a good colonoscopy? Well, no, but it's better than a bad one.
So what I'm saying is,
I mean, I'm 50 next year. I'm not going to lie to you. That's been scheduled for December.
Well, Dave, you're back to real points because I'm sorry, I get like, I know I'm gonna have to do it, but just the thought, never mind.
You're supposed to do it at 45, but you're supposed to do it at 45 nowadays. Instead of 50, by the way, they changed that. And, but Caleb, if you want to get ahead of the game and, just experience something new, you can go ahead and do yours now in your mid-30s.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so how do I go back from that?
It reminds me of that scene from Fletch. Who remembers this? Moon River.
Okay, all right.
Do you remember that?
No, I have never seen Fletch.
Okay.
All I'm trying to say is that
Caleb's so thrown off.
You are wrong on the whole that it depended on what. You're wrong on the whole that it depended on what Florida did. I distinctly remember when Tennessee realized they could win the East Peyton Mannings last year, they played horrible in November. They barely beat Vanderbilt again that year. And they barely beat South Carolina. Peyton Manning lost the Heisman because of how bad he played in November that year.
Yep.
And
also another thing to remember is that Philip Fulmer, and this was a smart move. This is not a criticism. He didn't do nearly as much coaching in the Vanderbilt Kentucky week. He was recruiting. And there were times where he would leave the practice field and go make phone calls to recruits. I mean, which was smart. I mean, because as long as you eat by and beat them, you don't want to eat by. Don't get me wrong. But
they did a lot of times with Vanderbilt. They never really did with Kentucky. I feel like they always blew out Kentucky, but that's because Kentucky, and you know this with Hal Mummy, they didn't care about defense. So Fulmer knew that they were going to put like 45 to 50 points against Kentucky, and air raid offense, a Tennessee defense was going to shut that down no matter what.